Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 330, coming to you from the exotic location in Toronto, the Courtyard by Marriott. And today I'm going to talk about a terrific record by Steve Kuhn, conducted and arranged by the great jazz whiz, really, Gary McFarland, called the October Suite. My copy, which I did not bring to Toronto to show you, but which looks pretty much like this one, is a 1967 promo release on Impulse. Steve Kuhn is one of the great third stream piano players, and he has quite a distinguished catalog on ECM records. But of course, this record isn't on ECM, it's on Impulse. It's a fascinating collaboration with another artist who is decidedly not an ECM type. McFarland was a musical polymath who died tragically young in kind of weird circumstances, which I'll discuss in a later review. He had jazz tendencies which had recently veered in the direction of pop and easy listening, but not on this record. What we have here is a conscious blending of small group classical instrumentation, either a wind quartet or a string quartet, plus a jazz trio, piano, bass, drums. The blending of classical and jazz sensibilities is the essence, kind of the holy grail of third stream jazz, and it doesn't always work. It sometimes fails, maybe often fails, by producing either turgid jazz or kind of classical light. But that's not the case here. What we get is something like a proto-ECM record some years before that label was actually founded. In fact, in retrospect, it's so much like an ECM record that it shouldn't be surprising that Manfred Eichner, the ECM founder, was inspired by this record, and it got him thinking about the kind of label that he wanted to develop. It's a very rewarding listen and a record which will definitely grow on you, and I will say it's probably better than the jazz and strings records that you have in your collection, or most of them anyway. Steve Kuhn was born in Brooklyn in 1938 to Hungarian immigrant parents. He was a jazz fan almost as soon as he could walk, and his family being musical, they discovered pretty soon that Steve had perfect pitch, so he begins piano lessons at age 5. Somewhere around the time he turned 10, the family moved to Boston, and it's there that his piano instruction moves up a notch. As somewhat of a child prodigy, he was enrolled to study with Margaret Chaloff, who was a much sought-after teacher in East Coast classical circles. He and his teacher formed a special bond, and in later years, Kuhn would attribute a lot of his success over time to the solid foundation he had with her. But while Margaret Chaloff's predilections were firmly classical, Kuhn's heart was actually in jazz. And while he was experimenting with the styles of people like Bud Powell and Art Tatum, he also had the opportunity to jam with his teacher's son, the saxophonist, Serge Chaloff. And with Serge being a few years older, getting him in the door, by his early teens, Kuhn was playing Boston jazz clubs. When he finished high school, he went to Harvard to study music, where, by his own admission, he barely graduated, having spent most of his time playing in a trio with the drummer Arnold Wise and the bassist Chuck Israels. That trio ended up getting a regular gig at a club across the street from campus in Harvard Square, and that gave Kuhn the opportunity to be a sideman for all kinds of great traveling musicians coming through, including people like Chet Baker. In the summer of 1959, Kuhn went to upstate New York to Lenox to attend the Summer School of Jazz there, and there the faculty included such great theorists as Gunther Schuller and George Russell, and the modal piano player Bill Evans, of course, who had just finished recording Kinda Blue with Miles Davis earlier that year. All of those musicians proved to be a major influence on Steve Kuhn. That summer, he also met Gary McFarland, an Army vet from California, who was now dabbling in writing and arranging and was making a bit of an impression at the summer school himself. But while Kuhn and McFarland would meet again, in the short term, the most important connection that Kuhn would make at the Lenox Summer School was with the trumpeter Kenny Dorham. Dorham ended up asking Kuhn to join his quartet, which he does, and he moves to New York and plays in the jazz clubs there for a year, attracting lots of positive critical notices and lots of attention, including attention from John Coltrane, who, in the early part of 1960, is thinking about starting what would eventually become his classic quartet, and the first version of that includes Kuhn on piano. At just 21 years of age, he played with Coltrane for 10 weeks that spring, along with Pete LaRocca on drums and Steve Davis on bass, until Coltrane was able to lure McCoy Tyner away from the jazztet and the piano chair was no longer his. Around this time, Kuhn also enters the studio with Pete LaRocca on drums and with the bassist Scott LaFaro to make a trio record called 1960, which wasn't released until 2005. And you can find that, but it's only on CD. In the early 60s, Kuhn played with Stan Getz, and then he went to play with Art Farmer, whose group also included LaRocca and the bass player Steve Swallow. And soon enough, Kuhn, LaRocca, and Swallow formed their own trio, and they released a record called Three Waves. This period in Kuhn's life is full of constant collaboration and development, and it continues in 1966 when McFarland and Kuhn get in touch with each other again and decide to pursue some of the ideas that had been impressed upon them by Gunther Schuller when they were at Lenox. McFarland was 5 years older than Kuhn, born in 1933 in LA, but he grew up in Southern Oregon in Grants Pass. He's generally considered to be self-taught. He came to music late in life, went to the University of Oregon and was in the Army, and it's in the Army that he began experimenting quite seriously with different musical instruments, and he eventually settles on the vibes after trying out different kinds of brass. After the Army, he got a scholarship to the Berklee School of Music in Boston, where he didn't stick, but he did go to the Lennox Summer School in 1959, where of course he meets Kuhn for the first time, as well as people like Ornette Coleman and John Lewis, who ends up being a bit of a mentor. McFarland's blossoming talents as a composer and arranger impressed a lot of people at Lennox, and they impressed a lot of people in New York when he went there afterwards. Pretty soon his music was being performed by people like Jerry Mulligan, John Lewis, Günter Schuller, and Stan Getz. One of his earliest and best-known projects was for Verve, and that was Stan Getz's big band Bossa Nova, the third of Getz's big three Bossa Nova records for the label. Another notable McFarland recording on Verve came soon after in 1963, the Gary McFarland Orchestra, which featured Bill Evans on piano. And he also began to record for Impulse at that point, his debut being a small group set, Point of Departure. But then in 1964, with his jazz cred firmly established, he shocked and dismayed the critics by releasing a pop crossover record, Soft Samba, which sold really well, and it's actually a record I really like. And for the rest of the 1960s, McFarland's output alternated between more pop-oriented records and then what you might call more orchestral, legit jazz albums. And those latter ventures were made possible by all the royalties from the pop output. Interestingly, the pop success didn't corrupt him. It only seemed to encourage him to innovate and stretch himself more in his more straight-up jazz compositions. And for one of his biggest stretches, the one that appears on this record, he gets hold of his old colleague from the summer school, Steve Kuhn, and they hatch a plan to bring some of the third-stream ideas of Günter Schuller to life on record. This record is comprised of 6 separate compositions from McFarland, 2 of which were from a prior project, a soundtrack to a sort of a witchcraft movie set in France starring David Niven called 13. The producer is Bob Thiel. The engineer, unusually for an Impulse recording, is not Rudy Van Gelder, but Phil Ramone, and it's recorded over 2 dates in the fall of 1966, very likely at Ramone's studio, A&R Studios in New York. The core trio is Steve Kuhn on piano, Ron Carter on bass, and Marty Morell on drums, with Gary McFarland arranging, composing, and conducting. In the studio session on October 14th, McFarland conducts the trio along with a string quartet, and the quartet's comprised of Isidore Cohen and Matthew Raimondi on violin, Al Brown on viola, and Charles McCracken on cello. That session yields the 3 tracks on side 1. On November the 1st, the string quartet is out. In comes a woodwind quartet plus Corky Hale on harp. There's no information about the specific instruments played by the woodwind quartet, but the quartet includes Don Ashworth, Irving Horowitz, Gerald Sanfino, and Joe Firentello, better known to most jazz fans as the CTI saxophone star Joe Farrell. Side 1 starts with Remember When, and what's remarkable about this from the very outset is how well the string quartet meshes with the improvisational jazz trio. And all the way through, Steve Kuhn is the glue. Carter and Morell are doing their thing, they're locked in, they're swinging. The quartet is doing its own thing, and Kuhn is moving effortlessly in between the two. Next is Saint-Tropez Shuffle, which McFarland says is a bossa nova in 3/4 time. I think the only real claim it has to being a bossa nova is liberal use of the hi-hat. But never mind, it's a great track, and it has a very interesting change to a much lighter and more melodic feel in the middle third. Side 1 closes with One I Could Have Loved, which weaves in and out between a more classical feel and jazzier solo passages, which kind of presage Keith Jarrett. And for me, these are some of the most beautiful moments in the whole record. Side 2 I'm slightly less keen on. I find that the string quartet works a little bit better than the woodwind quartet. It starts with Traffic Patterns, which is much edgier, and Kuhn here, well, at least when the woodwinds are present, he sounds like he's kind of jousting with them. And given the title, I suppose that was the intent. There is lots of dynamism in this track. Again, the middle third has a much lighter feel accented by the harp, but overall this feels a little more disjointed than any of the tracks on the first side. However, on Childhood Dreams, the second track, here Kuhn's piano and the woodwinds contrast and combine in a much more pleasing way. I think this is a real highlight of the record. Finally, Open Highway has lots of great moments and some of Kuhn's most passionate playing in the whole record. It even at points tries to swing, but overall I think this is a track which amounts to slightly less than the sum of its parts. This record is an experiment which works most of the time, and when it does, it's both beautiful and unique. It's one of the most successful attempts, and I'm not the first person to say this, to combine the methods of classical and jazz while remaining true to the spirit of both. It's a great record to pop on the turntable on a rainy morning when you've got a cup of tea in hand and a clear head to focus on the music. And for me, it's 4 out of 5 stars.